Welcome, everybody, to the Baker Institute Energy Forum. We're so pleased you could be with us here this morning for this special program. We're very lucky to have with us today Ambassador Richard Jones and our good friend Matt Simmons. We thank Simmons and Company for helping put together today's event, which I'm sure will prove very, very interesting at a very, very interesting time in the oil industry. I'm Amy Myers-Jaffe. I am the director of the Baker Institute Energy Forum. I would like to thank all our member companies for the funding they provide to allow us to put on programs like this today. Members are listed in the program, and also other research work that we're doing that's supported by this membership group. Just to give you a little update on what we're doing right now at the Baker Institute, we have our climate policy conference report will be coming out this month, and it'll be available on the 15th during our upcoming Transatlantic Climate Deliberations Conference on December 15th. We are also working on a major white paper on U.S. biofuels policy with support from Chevron Technology Ventures, and we should be releasing that again ahead of the inauguration of the new president. And we always have something cooking at the Baker Institute in terms of ongoing projects. So we're a little, as you see, Ken looks really, really tired, our other energy fellow, Ken Metlock, because you can see all the studies we're working on. We are now doing some intensive economic modeling of the consequences of having carbon priced in the U.S. energy market. We're also looking at emerging policies in China. We have a new group of economists working on the petrodollar cycle, and we're hoping to have a book out in about 3 to 6 months on the history of petrodollars in the U.S. economy and the interreactions thereof. We have an ongoing study now revisiting the topic of Russia and the Caspian and its importance to the global energy balance. And we have, together with the engineering department at Rice, doing work on Texas electricity, looking at issues like demand, impact of time-sensitive pricing and smart metering, and also looking at the air quality consequences of fuel choices in the state of Texas, which we think will have sort of a good, broad case study approach as a microcosm for maybe the whole U.S. market. So that's what we're doing here now at the Baker Institute. And I know you're all anxious to hear what the IEA thinks, so I'm just going to have 2 or 3 for our media guests, and for those of you who have not been coming to the ongoing seminars, 2 or 3 Baker Institute slides to set the context of the view to 2030. As I mentioned, we're looking at the history of the petrodollar interaction with the U.S. economy. So we don't necessarily say everything is necessarily causational, though we do have a study out looking at the interactions over time. But we do like to make the point, which this slide so lovelily summarizes, that there is this incredible coincidence between oil price spikes and the history of financial crises. And it's been going on since the 1800s, and so it should be no surprise that it happened again when oil prices soared up to 147. So I'm just going to talk about 2 or 3 of the myths that the industry told itself as the price was going to 147, that comforted itself that it would go past 147, zoom to 200, and stay there forever. One was that American drivers are completely price insensitive. Demand for oil is totally inelastic and will remain that way forever. And economies will continue to grow no matter how high the price of oil goes. So this chart illustrates that last summer's gasoline driving season was the rule that actually proved the rule, which is that even in the United States, where people take pride in their car, prices do matter. And we're seeing the double impact now of both original consumer reaction to the elasticity of demand, both in people's less, for the first time, last 2 years, we've seen a drop in vehicle miles traveled in the United States, combined with a switch back to more fuel-efficient cars. In addition, now that we have economic slowdown, we're seeing additional corollary effects. So the bottom line is the market has now, of course, corrected itself based on perceptions that prices do cause a contraction in demand. The other myth that was very popular out in the Middle East, and I've been out to the Middle East several times as the price was going up, and it's unbelievable how many people talked about this, and that is that it doesn't matter what happens in the United States because we're going to sell all our oil to China. And so even though I'm very optimistic about the long-term outlook for oil demand in China, and I'm sure Ambassador Jones will go into that at length, I like to show people this chart to scale so you can see how far away the blue line, which is the United States, is from the red line, which is China, and how the dip in the United States blue line in the first box up above doesn't have any close possibility of crisscrossing with the slight uptick in the Chinese red line. And so the perception in the Middle East that somehow they're just going to take all these barrels they were selling to America and move them over to China was kind of a pretty ridiculous presumption that somehow that would manage to hold the oil price up at $147 a barrel. The second myth was that the U.S. economy was decoupled from the rest of the world, and price subsidies will shield demand in all other countries. And again, we now all have made it pretty clear, I think, to the rest of the world that they are not decoupled from the U.S. economy, for better or worse. And then in addition, with last week's announcement, I think it became pretty clear that as prices are volatile and countries try to cope with their own energy and climate policies, that in the end, especially in major places like China, Malaysia, and elsewhere in Asia, price subsidies were removed. And the myth that it doesn't matter what the price goes to, the Chinese want, economic growth and they'll pay anything for it, was also incorrect. And the idea that the Chinese will just subsidize oil no matter how high the price goes was also a fallacious idea that gained a lot of momentum and prominence because we were in a bubble mania. And when everybody's in a bubble mania, they say things over and over and over again that seem to make sense at the moment, but when the mania passes and you sit and think about it, it doesn't make sense at all. And I remember standing up in May, we had a conference here in May on our global risk study, and explaining to people that naphtha demand in China in May was down 2% on the year, and that fuel oil demand was down 2% year on year. And I mean, what do you use naphtha for? You use naphtha for petrochemicals. What do you use fuel oil for? Electricity and heavy industry. And so where was this love that China was going to have oil demand growing through the roof? It was pre-Olympics. And post-Olympics, we would see a different picture, and time will tell. But anyway, so, and then we've looked at this question of, so the big question everybody's asking, and I don't know if Ambassador Jones's presentation will be able to adjust itself since he's taken the very long view, but the question is, when does demand return? So we did a little modeling on that, just looking at scenarios in the United States for GDP growth returning. And you can see that if we stay flat through this year, I mean, we didn't even scenario out going negative, which I suppose now looks like a possibility. But you can see that if we stay flat, the uptick to 2010 is very shallow, and that it would really take a really dramatic turnaround of going back to 1% growth to really get oil demand cooking again. So we throw that out. And then I know the media always likes this chart. So even though it's not 100% relevant to today's program, just to remind everyone, a $40 oil price is about $1.80 gasoline in historic terms, based on the historical relationship between retail prices and WTI prices in the United States. So everybody should run out and fill up at the $1.43 that's available on Stella Link, because that's a little low compared to an average $40 oil price. So And then finally, and this does have bearing, so to set up Ambassador Jones's comments today, there is this big debate now that I think will take part in the industry, and I've heard it presented both ways. One of them is oil supply will get stuck at 100 million barrels a day. We might have difficulty given problems in declining resource in the OECD, inefficiency and problems with national oil companies in key prolific countries. Maybe it's not realistic to think about world oil supply going above 100 million barrels a day out to 2030, both for geopolitical reasons and somewhat geologic reasons. But I've heard a flip side presentation, so I just open your mind to the opposite channel, because I think the stuck at 100 million barrels a day of supply gets a lot of advertisement. But the question is, could demand get stuck at 100 million barrels a day? And I heard that first proposed at a seminar we had in London in October, and it's a very interesting idea. So the question is, if we had very strong policy come in under President Obama, and it was mirrored by cooperation with China and other OECD countries, could we see demand actually flatten out over time, despite the sort of general projections about what happens with the rise in incomes in Asia, and to think sort of creatively about some of the policies that are either being proposed or have already been put in place other places, and could they really hold gasoline demand flat in places that we were expecting to have very large increases, including the United States, which, as I showed you on that chart, really has more bearing on the gasoline question at this point than China. And so to give you an idea of what I mean, you have to think about the fact that European demand has been so flat for several decades. Think about what's coming in California legislation in a new package that's before the regulators of that state. And thinking about, over time, what would happen if these kinds of policies got passed across the United States and then were adopted in China. And we're seeing sort of hints of that now with the discussion of having a consumption tax in China, which is a really big, dramatic change from the kinds of things analysts have been talking about over the last 10 years. So we did a short schematic, and we included the rebound effect, so you can't just take the number of cars and multiply by the CAFE standard. But just to give you an idea, this myth about China replacing the United States, if you think about how much oil demand you're expecting from China, and Ambassador Jones will go into detail on this, we're not talking about 20 million barrels a day, we're talking about 5 or 10 million barrels a day. Well, what if Obama really puts in his 50 mile per gallon CAFE that he's proposed, and that was part of the settlement with Detroit, and we actually got there. The savings in a million barrels a day in the United States would be 6.7 million barrels a day. So even if China had no policies, which I think is kind of unlikely at this point, the United States might counterweigh the entire increase from China. And so I just sort of open your minds to the thinking that in the iPod world, living with teenagers, that everything we've been saying for 20 years could really change rather rapidly in terms of the policy framework under which oil demand will progress over time, depending on where the political will is and what policies are adopted. So with that, I welcome you. We have a great program this morning. I'm going to ask Matt Simmons to come up and do the introductions. Let me just say, Matt is a leading voice in the energy industry. I'm not going to go through his bio. I think a lot of us know Matt and all the great accomplishments he's had, not only in our industry, keeping everybody honest and keeping the debate at a very high level of interest and enthusiasm throughout the world, but also for the great work he does in Houston in the various organizations that he's put his great talents to. So, Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy, and what a pleasure to be able to introduce Ambassador Richard Jones. 2 years ago, I had the same privilege of introducing Dr. Fatih Birol, who came here to release the findings of the first time anyone had ever basically looked under the cover and say, how much will it actually cost to create the energy we think we're going to use? And I think what we're going to hear today is a far more stunning sort of new look into the reality of oil. I find it particularly ironic to be now able to say what great friends I've become of Dr. Birol and Nubu Tanaka, and now meeting Ambassador Jones, because it was a decade ago that I was railing out so loudly against the International Energy Agency and their concept of the missing barrels, the world's largest oil glut that never showed up any place. And the third week in October, I finally get to Perth, Australia, where I'm a keynote speaker at a Society of Petroleum Engineering biannual Asia-Pacific conference on the impact of the Asian financial crisis on the oil markets now and into the future. And I get a fax when I check into the hotel, and it's from a friend, George Yates, the head of the IPAA, saying, Senator Domenici has just called for the General Accounting Office to launch an investigation into the IEA's missing barrels. And turned out they weren't there. It was a myth. But luckily, about 5 years ago, Dr. Birol became the chief economist and started taking a very different view about let's actually get real and get into digging into the details. A year ago, he called me and said, you know, I'm sick and tired of basically having people sort of brush off the fact that we don't have any field-by-field data, and I'm going to go get it. Come hell or high water. He got the most unbelievably strong backing by Mr. Tanaka, the new executive director of the IEA. And today, as you'll hear from Ambassador Jones, the IEA has a very different message. I want to just give you the bullet points that I've been using that came out of the press conference on the 12th of November, when they basically unveiled for the first time the WEO 2008. These were basically the sort of takeaway points is the current energy supply trends are patently unsustainable, that the future of human prosperity depends on how we tackle our energy issues, that the consequences of both policy and investment inaction are shocking, that massive investment will be required, field-by-field decline rates are accelerating, and the very last sentence of the executive summary was, time is running out and the time to act is now. This is, to me, like watching a VLCC stop dead in the water and spin around and go backwards. It's a very, very different and important message, and I really I applaud what Dr. Birol is doing. I had an email from him a couple of days ago saying, well, I was in Moscow Thursday and Friday to packed crowds hearing this, and I'm on my way to Beijing to have discussions with the highest level of Chinese officials. So the three of them are really spreading the word about what they found. Let me tell you just a brief bit about Ambassador Richard Jones. He took up his position as Deputy Executive Director on October 1st, so he is what we call new to the job, but he's certainly not new to experience. He's had over 30 years of diplomatic and policy experience, serving as ambassador to 4 countries, Israel from 2005 to 2008, Kuwait 2001, 2004, Kazakhstan 1998, 2001, and Lebanon 96 to 98. He also acted as the Secretary of State, Senior Advisor and Coordinator of Iraq Policy from February to August 2005. His earlier diplomatic postings in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, he forecast the analysis of the development of price changes in 1986. The most important for us, he was born in 1950 in Shreveport, Louisiana, one of our oil-filled neighboring states. He received his bachelor's degree in mathematics with distinction from Harvard Mudd College in Claremont, California, where I was just reminding Hugh B. Clark, one of the great heroes of mine in the oilfield, served for years as chairman of the board, and has his MS and PhD in business statistics from the University of Wisconsin. I have a hard time speaking English and American. He is native, in addition to his native English, his foreign languages include Arabic, French, Russian, and German. And he and his wife Joan have 4 children. So, Ambassador Jones, welcome to Houston, and thank you for being here.
Do we have the mouse? Where is it?
Let's see. What you do?
Maybe it's under here.
Yeah, that's for pointing, and here's for the next and back.
Oh, okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank Amy and Matt for those excellent introductions. They've set a high standard. I hope I can live up to the standard that they have laid for me. Before I actually start talking about the World Energy Outlook, I thought I'd just mention a little bit of information about the International Energy Agency itself. As Matt and Amy pointed out, I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the agency. Nobuo Tanaka is the Executive Director, and so I'm his deputy. The IEA is an international organization. Its member states are drawn from the members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We're headquartered in Paris. Basically, we have 28 member countries. I think Poland is the latest country to join. And we are charged with protecting the energy security of our member countries. The IEA was formed in the aftermath of the '73 oil shock. And in those days, we looked at security, particularly from the standpoint of a security of supply of oil. Of course, over the years, times have changed in energy markets, and the IEA has changed along with them. In addition to following oil, we now follow gas, we follow coal, we have experts on electricity, we also look at nuclear power, and increasingly we're looking at newer technologies, renewables, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, and so on. So we're taking a much broader definition of security these days than we did in the past. We still are very active in planning for emergencies. And in fact, just this past summer during the hurricane season, we were in practically constant contact with the Department of Energy in the run-up to Hurricanes Gustav and Ike in particular. So we get very involved in traditional energy security, but like I say, more and more we're getting involved in energy security from a broader definition or a broader viewpoint. The organization has about 190 employees. Our budget is, our core budget is about 25 million euros a year. That's financed by contributions from member countries. There's a scale, and it depends on their, basically their economic weights as to who pays what. But in addition to that, we sell publications. I urge you all to visit our website. The publications aren't cheap. The World Energy Outlook goes for 150 euros, about $200. But we think they're worth it, and they bring in us $4 or $5 million a year nowadays. And in addition, we also have about 5 million or 6 million euros a year in voluntary contributions. Most of the voluntary contributions come from member governments, but increasingly we are getting contributions from private individuals, or organizations, I should say, including companies, but also academic institutions and foundations. Sometimes the contributions are financial, and sometimes they're what we call assistance in kind, seconding people and so on. And so we have a very active program of exchanges with industry and with, as well as with our member states and various organizations in them. The World Energy Outlook is considered our flagship publication. We bring it out every year. Usually it has a scenario, which is basically where we think things are likely to go on current policies. We don't try and forecast policies. After all, we have to report to our member states, and they might take affront if we start telling. I mean, we can tell them in private; they don't mind that. But if we started telling them in public, you should do this and you should do that. So, although we get to do that once every 5 years with our in-depth reviews of people's policy, but in any event, the World Energy Outlook, the reference scenario, is always based on the concept that the policies at mid-year will continue, because mid-year is basically when we lock in the policy framework. So, for example, this year's report, the policies were locked in as of the middle of 2008. So we don't pick up things like the recent changes in Chinese subsidy policy and so on. But in addition to the reference scenario, we almost always have a special focus for the World Energy Outlook. Last year, the special focus was on China and India. This year, the special focus is on climate. But there's also some attention given to cities, which is a departure, and to energy poverty in Africa. But most of what I'm going to talk about today deals with the first two parts of the World Energy Outlook, namely the reference scenario and what it means for climate policy. So with those introductions, I'll move on. Is that right? That's not what is supposed to be there.
That's not the slides?
No, those aren't the right slides.
Let's see what we got.
Yeah, that's the executive summary. Well, so does anybody know any good jokes? While I'm twisting in the wind up here, I thought I'd like to take advantage of the fact I was introduced as an American ambassador, and I've been an ambassador 4 times. But I have a friend in the audience, a very close friend. He's hiding in the back, who is about to become an ambassador for the very first time. His name is Gene Kretz. He's a distinguished Foreign Service officer in the back row. Come on, Gene, stand up. And Gene was my deputy in Tel Aviv. He's had a distinguished career. He served in Cairo and Damascus, and he's about to take up his duties in Tripoli, Libya. So he will be a historic ambassador, because it will be the first ambassador that we've had in Libya since I don't know when, since relations were broken many, many years ago. So I hope you all have a chance to meet Gene and wish him well, because he's certainly taking up one of the toughest jobs that we have in the Foreign Service today. Oh. Is this going to be on the webcast? They're really nice slides. You'll enjoy them when they come up.
Perhaps when they are setting up, you may be able to answer one question, at least on the mind of some. Usually IEA does not increase the crude oil prices by 100% in such a short time like 1 year. Can you tell us, or have you faced this problem when this has been presented in different parts of the world? Why and how the crude oil prices have been increased 100% from last year to like $200, which is 120.
You mean in our scenario?
In your scenario.
Yeah, I don't.
That is the one which has really struck me the most, having been in the business of forecasting crude oil prices and learning that one cannot forecast crude oil prices. How did you happen to do this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, that's a very good point. I want to make it clear, we don't forecast prices. Our reference scenario is not a forecast. In fact, it's the last scenario we would actually like to see take place or develop. What it is what we see would happen if current policies were left unchanged. And we make certain other assumptions. And the price assumption only comes out from the model to balance supply and demand in the model. The model starts off with the basic assumption of growth and the policy set. And if you take the IMF growth assumptions, we use IMF and OECD figures because we're forecasting out over 20 years. So you got to kind of patch together different people's forecasts to get a growth number. And basically, this scenario is driven by a 3.3% real growth forecast, which is slightly lower than the previous scenario. But one of the reasons that we believe that it is lower is because oil prices went up dramatically in the last year, and so we're looking at a higher base as we move into the period of the forecast this year in comparison to last year. In fact, if you look at the numbers that came out of our models, is that it? Yeah. Okay. At the time we were making the forecasts or developing it, the oil price was, on its way to $147 a barrel. And so the fact we were saying we think the average price between now and 2015 is only $100 a barrel shows we didn't expect that price was going to stay up at those levels. We thought it would stay up for a while, but then come back down. So the average over 7 years would be $100 a barrel. And even though we're now down at whatever, I think it's 44 today, roughly. given the gyration we've seen in the last year, I'm not prepared to say that our forecast of an average price of $100 between now and 2015 is wrong. So, but like I say, it's not a forecast, it's what comes out of the scenario. And the whole purpose of doing the scenario is to get people to change their policies, as you'll see. With that introduction, before I put up the first slide, I want to talk a little bit about the context, since we've already gotten into it. Obviously, we've had very dramatic global events. First record high prices, and then a record fall in prices, and now falling energy demand in many regions. Obviously, the global financial developments have been very alarming as well. And we believe that these developments have diverted world attention from longer-term concerns about energy security and climate change over the past few months. But we see many uncertainties still remaining. For example, what is the medium and long-term future for energy demand? Let's see if I can get this right. Is that, yeah. Could energy project delays and deferrals, which we're seeing now as a result of the financial crisis, mean that a future supply crunch will choke off economic recovery even as it starts to get off the ground? Can we regain our focus on energy security, environmental concerns in time to prevent future crises? And will the COP15, the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that takes place next December in Copenhagen, will those climate change negotiations next year muster the political will needed to ensure implementation of a sound post-2012 climate framework? In times of economic hardship, it's all too easy to lose sight of the longer-term concerns. But we'd like to draw an analogy with driving a car. It's very difficult to drive a car if you just look at the events or the obstacles right in front of you. You end up swerving from left to right. But if you look up and you look down the road, even major obstacles require small course corrections. And so we kind of think oil policy is like driving a car, that focusing on the path ahead makes for a smoother and safer ride, whether you're driving a car or piloting oil policy. So while the global financial conditions facing us are nothing short of critical, it's vital that we keep our eyes on the target of a more secure, sustainable energy future for all. And this year's WEO, as we'd like to call it affectionately, makes this strikingly clear. As Matt pointed out, it really has some of our strongest messages yet. And at the same time, though, I think it brings a message of hope. Because we do not only have the reference scenario in this year's report, we also have two alternate scenarios. And I think they show that there is a better path than the one we're now on. And it's a path that can, and I say can, not will, because it's not an easy path. It's a path that's going to require a lot of investment, a lot of courageous political leadership. But we believe that there is a path that can deliver abundant, sustainable energy at lower prices than the reference scenario, that can support healthy economic growth around the world, and with fewer emissions of climate-changing greenhouse gases. So with that, I'll get into some of the details of the reference scenario. Oops, still don't have this down yet. Okay. This is the evolution of world primary energy demand in the reference scenario. And you can see that you can have continued rapid growth. Just to make sure everybody understands, the color chart, the lowest, the black, is demand for oil. Coal is in the brown, gas is gray, biomass is the mustard color, nuclear is yellow, hydro is blue, and other renewables are green. And you can see that this reference scenario, or business as usual model, which I stress is premised on policies as they existed in mid-year 2008 and assumes the 3.3% average world growth. It shows primary energy demand growing by 45% from 2007 to 2030, almost 50%. It's an average annual growth of 1.6%. This is down slightly from the World Energy Outlook of last year, which was 1.8%. And one of the reasons it's down is because we see the higher prices. Under this scenario, fossil fuels will account for around 80% of the overall increase in energy demand between now and 2030. It's not shown on the graph, but it's important to note that non-OECD countries account for 87% of global energy growth between 2007 and 2030, according to the scenario. I fully take Amy's point that China is way down there compared to the United States, but it will grow rapidly. In fact, the increase in China's energy demand outpaces that of all other countries and regions, according to this scenario. Also, I think it's interesting to see how rapidly coal grows. It becomes an increasingly important part of the energy mix in this scenario. In fact, it consolidates its position as the world's second most important energy source after oil. Again, this is largely driven by demand in the what we used to call the third world, particularly China and India. The overall increase in global energy demand is driven largely by rising population and steady economic growth. And that's the point, is that if you want growth, if you want people's incomes to be rising, their standards of living, and you know that the population is going to be driving, you can see, if you just do the math, even though we're becoming more and more efficient, the energy demand is getting to very large numbers. And our analysis shows that these current trends, we believe, are unsustainable, as Matt pointed out, socially, environmentally, and economically. First of all, rising oil and gas demand leads to higher imports, greater reliance on OPEC and other non-OECD country suppliers, and higher oil prices. As we have already talked about, in 2007 dollars, we're foreseeing $122 a barrel by 2030. But in nominal prices, that's over $200 a barrel by 2030, which is breathtaking, even given the heights we've seen this last summer. Increased use of fossil fuels would also aggravate climate change. And to prevent this, the IEA is urging all governments, not only those of our member countries, to encourage a shift to cleaner and more efficient technologies. And I'll be talking a lot more about this as we look at the coming slides. Let's see if there are any other things I should point out. What we see, just to give you some of the additional statistics that don't show up on the charts, we're looking at oil growth of about 1% per annum. So it would grow about, its share would grow to 34% of total energy. Coal will be growing at about 2%. It will approach nearly 30% of global energy use by 2030. Gas grows at 1.8%, reaching 22% of global energy. Nuclear, we see a little less than 1% at 0.9%. And this is an increase from last year. Last year we only saw 0.7%. We're seeing policies towards nuclear seem to be evolving in a more positive direction, so we've upped that forecast. Hydropower grows at 1.9%, biomass 1.4%. Other renewables grow at 7.2% in this scenario. And as I mentioned again, the growth assumption is 3.3. Last year it was 3.6%. And I already talked about oil prices. So if we look at the next slide. Okay, this is the continuing importance of coal in particular. And what's on the screen now is not a forecast. This is historical data. For the last 7 years, coal has actually averaged annual rate of growth of 4.8%. Whereas oil and gas are down there. Oil is only 1.6%, gas 2.6%. Renewables have been growing at 2.2% and nuclear at 0.8%. And now this is some of the stuff out of the scenario. In our reference scenario projections of 2030, coal demand advances by, as I mentioned, by 2% a year. If this happens, coal will account for over 1/3 of the increase in total energy demand to 2030. Non-OECD countries, by the way, will account for 97% of the increase in global coal demand. So within the OECD, coal is not growing, but outside the OECD, it's growing rapidly. China alone accounting for 2/3 of the demand increase. And most of this comes from power generation. Coal is a fuel of choice for power generation. And you can see that in non-OECD countries, which are the left bar, coal represents 40% almost of the incremental energy demand, whereas in OECD countries, it's less than 10% compared to all other fuels. I should say that China accounts for 2/3 of global coal demand growth, India another 19%. So together they provide 85% of the increase in those two countries. Okay, now this is how renewables are doing, particularly in electricity generation. The top 3 bars are for the world for the 3 years, 2006, 2015, 2030. Then the middle 3 are for the OECD countries, developed countries, and then the non-OECD countries are the lower bar. And you can see that with regard to renewable energy, most of the increase in use is for electricity generation. The share of renewables in total electricity generation rises from 18% in 2006 to almost 23% in 2030 in the reference scenario. In fact, renewables overtake gas to become the second largest source of power generation after coal in this scenario. And this, I think sounds pretty significant. But this is the reference scenario. This is on current policies we see this happening. If policies change towards a reduction of emissions in our 2 alternate scenarios, we see the share of renewables in electrical generation rising to 30% or as high as 40%. Most of the increase in renewables-based power generation occurs in OECD countries, not surprisingly. Non-hydro revenues, or renewables, sorry, output grows strongly from 3% to 14%. And in non-OECD countries, however, the overall growth is lower, but it's starting from a much lower base, so it actually quintuples. It goes from 1% to about 5%. And in terms of what, these are shares of electricity, and electricity demand itself is growing. So that means that the output from these sources is growing even more. The electricity demand growth in the OECD is forecast at 1.1%, but in the non-OECD area, it's 3.8% per year, as more and more developing countries undertake rural electrification or expand the access to electricity in cities. Okay. Now this is the change in oil demand. For the moment, ignore the top 3 OECD areas, but you see how we see demand evolving around the world outside the OECD. Particularly note the strong growth in demand we see in China for oil, but also, interestingly, the Middle East, which we always just think of as the source of oil, actually is becoming a major consumer as well, the Middle East as a group. So that it is, in fact, outstrips India slightly under the reference scenario in terms of the increase in oil demand. But the two together, let's see, well, China alone is 43%, and India and the Middle East are about 20%, so the 3 together is well over 80%. Let's see. Okay, and I should state that I talked about the growth in demand for oil is 1% per year on average, so that oil demand grows from 85 million barrels per day in 2007 to 106 million barrels per day in 2030. If you actually add all these up, you actually get that's an increase of 21 million barrels per day. If you actually add all these slides up, these bars up, you actually get more than 21 million barrels per day. And that's because in the OECD areas, demand for oil is falling in all OECD areas. In the Pacific, in Europe, and even now in North America, we are forecasting that demand for oil will actually fall. It's not a huge fall, but it's significant that it's not growing, and we believe this is mostly due to declining non-transport oil demand. As a result, our demand share or I should say, for the first time in 2015, the share of non-OECD demand will pass the share of OECD demand. So for the first time, OECD demand will be less than 50% of world oil demand. And this has a big implication for the ability of OECD countries to continue to dominate world energy markets. And it's interesting because back in 1980, non-OECD demand for oil was only 35%. Right now, it's only 43%. So it went up 8% in 28 years, but now we're seeing that it's going to go up almost another 8% in only 7 years. So you can see that the demand in the non-OECD world accelerates under the reference scenario. Okay, now let's look a little bit more at where all this fossil fuels are coming from. This is a simple, three simple bar graphs for oil, gas, and coal. And the blue is for OECD, and the yellow is non-OECD. So you can see, although OECD supply continues to grow, it's at a fraction of the non-OECD. For both, well, the left is historical, and the right bar is the forecast. Gas, instead of growing, we actually see that supply in OECD countries of gas is going to be falling. So more than 100% of the growth in gas will be from non-OECD countries, because particularly in Europe, gas production will decline. In coal, OECD production also grows, but not nearly as rapidly as the non-OECD. Let's see. And one of the things that we see happening out of this is that there'll be an increasing concentration of oil, gas, and coal production in a small number of major non-OECD producing countries. And there'll be a rise in OECD countries in aggregate. There are some exceptions. Europe's oil imports in absolute terms and as a share of total demand continue to rise, but North America and Pacific regions see net oil imports decline under the reference scenario. Gas, however, all three OECD regions see an increase in imports during the period. And in our view, these trends should intensify concerns about our vulnerability to a price shock resulting from a supply disruption, particularly since a growing share of these imports are expected to come from the Middle East via vulnerable maritime routes like the Straits of Hormuz in the Arabian Gulf. Okay, now to get all the increase in supply that is implied by our growing demand, we see a strong need for investment in the reference scenario. In fact, the projections call for a cumulative investment in energy supply infrastructure of $26.3 trillion in 2007 dollars over the period 2007 to 2030. And this is about a little over 4.4 trillion higher than in last year's report because of an upward revision in costs, which have continued to soar in the last year. Now, this may change as a result of the financial crisis and declining commodity prices. But up until now, this is, we think, is the most logical outlook. Of the 26.3 trillion, 63% is needed in non-OECD countries. More than half of the global investment, 13.6 trillion, goes to the power sector, and it's split roughly 50-50 between generation and transmission. The oil and gas, this is oil and this is gas, total 11.7 trillion. That's about 44% of the total investment needed. You can see in the oil area, most of it's for exploration and development, a little bit for refining, and a very small amount for shipping. Gas is similar, but in addition, we have the LNG chain in there, taking about 8% of the investment. Coal is interesting. That's the black one on the right. You can see it's much smaller. It's only 3% of total investment. Less than, this says 0.7 trillion. I think the actual figure is 730 billion. And that is one of the reasons why I think you can see coal has a bright future in our reference scenario, because it's a major source of incremental demand, but it only requires a very small part of the investment. So it's a cheap way of getting incremental energy for a lot of countries, especially China. And then biofuels only gets $200 billion worth of investment in our reference scenario. But quite honestly, there are major concerns about whether all of this investment will in fact be forthcoming, particularly in the near term in view of the current financial crisis. Okay, now I'm going to get into a little bit greater depth on oil supply prospects. World oil production has to grow significantly, but how is it going to grow? And we're going to look at a couple of different ways of looking at it. So first of all, if you talk about net of processing gains, we're actually talking about a projected rise in oil production from 82 million barrels a day to 104 million barrels per day in our reference scenario. Now, the dark blue-green is non-OPEC conventional production. And you notice, if you look carefully, that it's actually, according to our scenario, it's actually peaked in 2007. It's basically flat, but it's a slight downward trend between 2007, 2015, and 2030. We are running out of oil in the OECD, or non-OPEC sphere. However, that's conventional oil. Technology is giving us the opportunity to begin exploiting non-conventional sources of oil, and we see them growing at a fairly good peak, so that overall non-OPEC supply does continue to grow gradually, but not very rapidly. On the OPEC side, the top two colors, the mustard and the red, the mustard is Middle East, the red is other OPEC. You can see there is a rapid expansion. So the bulk of the increase in world oil output is expected to come from OPEC countries, mainly in the Middle East. Their collective share rises from 44% in 2007 to 51% in 2030. And that's portrayed by this red line that just came up on the screen. So here in 2007, we're at 44%, and in 2030, we're up to 51%. That's the collective share of OPEC countries, and you can look at the scale on the right to see those numbers. In fact, we believe that the reserves of OPEC countries are actually large enough, and their development costs are low enough for the output that could grow at faster than this. But investment in these countries, we assume, will be constrained by several factors, including conservative depletion policies and geopolitical concerns. It's not on the chart, but Saudi Arabia remains the world's largest producer throughout the projection period. Its output climbs from today's about 2007's 10.2 million barrels per day, where it's about 28 and a little over 28% of OPEC supply, to 15.6 million barrels per day in 2030, which is greater than more than a 50% increase in just 22 years. One of the reasons, by the way, that we see our Saudi forecast growing this strongly is because of natural gas liquids. The Saudis are increasing their production of gas, and the natural gas liquids come along with that. And so we see natural gas liquids as being an important fillip to the Saudi total oil production. So when I cite figures on oil production, they include natural gas liquids. If you strip out the natural gas liquids, it would be a little over 2 million barrels per day less, I think, which is very much in line with what the Saudis have announced. I mentioned the non-OPEC conventional oil production is already at a plateau. It's projected to start declining. So, this is a peak oil of a sort. But thanks to non-conventional, non-OPEC output, overall continues to grow. Now, of course, one of the sources of non-OPEC conventional, or one of the major sources of non-OPEC non-conventional oil is Canadian oil sands. And you may have seen a lot of press recently about delays in projects for Canadian oil sands. But I was in Ottawa yesterday, and believe me, I'm really happy to be here today because it was cold in Ottawa yesterday. It was about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It's below 0 in centigrade. But anyway, I raised this question with Canadian officials, and they expressed basically confidence that the announcements that had been made were for projects that were at very early stages. They could be put back to where they are now fairly quickly, and that the projects that are much more developed were in fact going ahead. And so they were relatively confident that Canadian oil sands have a bright future, and that future is not significantly delayed in spite of what has been in the media. Okay. Now, this is getting into, this is, I think, my favorite slide because it reminds me of a graph I did when I was in Baghdad. But in any event, it is sources of oil by the type of oil rather than by the previous slide where we saw by region. And the dark blue is crude oil from currently producing fields. The green is non-conventional oil. The yellow is natural gas liquids, which is why I went ahead and mentioned those. The light blue is the crude oil that is yet to be developed. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be found necessarily. It says developed or found because this light blue would include enhanced oil recovery from existing fields. But basically, what you see here is that we believe in existing fields without enhanced oil recovery, you're going to get a steady decline in production. In other words, those already in production as of 2007. So what this means that gross additions to capacity far exceed the net additions needed to meet the growth in demand. In fact, our analysis shows that future capacity needs are far more sensitive to decline rates of existing fields than the rate of growth in demand is. In other words, the expected rates of decline at fields that are past their peak is much, much greater than the expected rate of demand growth. And so it's almost like you're on a treadmill, and you have to run faster just to stay in place. And in fact, you can see that this difference here by 2030, to make what we believe the oil production will be under the reference scenario, you've got an incremental amount of about 40, or no, it's about 60 million barrels. So it's basically six Saudi Arabias that you need to come up with, which is a pretty daunting prospect. Yeah, in fact, gross additions between 2007 and 2030 have to amount to 64 million barrels per day. 2/3 of this amount is needed just to offset decline rates in existing fields, which is 4 Saudi Arabias. So 2 Saudi Arabias for growth in demand, 4 Saudi Arabias for decline in production. So in other words, 2/3 of world production will come from new fields or enhanced oil recovery that are either waiting development today or yet to be found. And as a result, production of conventional crude only increases modestly from 70 to 75 million barrels per day. That's just 7% over 20 years. So we're seeing conventional crude not going up very rapidly at all. As I mentioned before, the shares of natural gas liquids and non-conventional oil are growing rapidly, though, in total oil production. So that's a pretty bleak prospect. But in some sense, it's even worse. This is another way of looking at supply, and this is the split in the source of supply between national oil companies and private companies. So for 2007, i.e. currently, and then the two points in the reference scenario, 2015 and 2030. And you can see what happens is that the private oil companies, their production does grow slightly, but not nearly as fast as the production of national oil countries. We do a little better in gas, but in oil in particular, the national oil companies grow much faster. So this indicates that there's a new hierarchy that's emerging in the upstream oil and gas industry. National oil companies obviously nowadays control most of the proven reserves, but they right now account for a much smaller share of current production. But we see this changing, and in the reference scenario, national oil companies account for about 80% of the total increase in world production of both oil and gas. In most of the countries with the largest oil and gas reserves, national companies dominate the oil and gas industry. Foreign companies are either not allowed to own and develop resources or are subject to severe restrictions. So the international oil companies, which have traditionally dominated the global oil and gas industry, are increasingly going to be squeezed by the growing power of national oil companies and by dwindling reserves and production in mature basins outside of OPEC. And I know this is not good news for many people in this audience here. I don't think it's good news for any of us, because how the evolution of the structure of the global oil and gas industry proceeds in coming decades will have important implications for investment, production capacity, prices, and economic growth. The increasing dominance of national companies may make it less certain that the investment projected in this reference scenario will actually be made. The long-term policies of major resource-rich countries, as I mentioned before, favor slower depletion of their resources. Also, the national companies in general have sometimes have different priorities than the international oil companies. For example, they may have responsibilities for promoting welfare in their countries, distribution of income responsibilities. And in general, they may be less well placed to address financial, technical, and managerial challenges in bringing new upstream capacity on stream. So if there's a weakness in our reference scenario, I'd say this is it, is that we basically assume that somehow the investment will be forthcoming, even as we see that it's shifting. There is one bright spot, though, and that is that if you shift more and more of the investment to these countries where the resources or the reserves are relatively abundant, it means you're exploiting cheaper deposits of oil. So it is true that particularly in OPEC countries, that for the same dollar of investment, you can actually get more oil, and so that could help lower the total investment needs and therefore maybe help keep prices down. But I don't think any of us are really too comfortable with giving even more market power to these countries. But one of the things that it does argue for, I think, is for stronger partnerships between the national and international oil companies, because that would give the international oil companies the ability to influence the national oil companies, and it would help the national oil companies overcome their weaknesses. In particular, international oil companies, I think, clearly know how to raise money, and they could become an important source of financing for national oil companies. Okay, this has all been about supply and demand for the oil and how we're evolving. Not only is the pattern of demand evolving more towards the developing world, but the pattern of supply is also moving in that direction. And I'm not sure that is going to be good. But regardless of where the oil is consumed, or produced for that matter, as long as we're talking about the oil being consumed, there's going to be an implication for climate change. And that's why we've decided to take a look at that. And the news on climate change, in some sense, is even worse than the news on the evolution of the patterns of supply and demand. For example, okay, this is the outlook, the blue is the outlook for emissions from OECD countries, from developed countries. And you can see the horizontal line here in the middle is where we are today. And we've grown quite a bit in the last 25, 30 years, but we're not projected to grow much more over the next 20 plus years. We're pretty much, there's a slight increase, but it's not very great. And this is under existing policies. So, you know, as mixed as the efforts in the OECD countries have been, in fact, overall, we're projecting that we've pretty much stabilized emissions. Maybe at too high a level, but at least we're not seeing an increase. That's the good news. The bad news is the rest of the world isn't there yet. So the bars that are the lines that just came on are for the non-OECD. So this is what happens with non-OECD coal as a source of emission, almost doubles. Non-OECD oil also increases significantly. Gas as well. And the small dark blue is bunkers and aviation, which is not a major contributor compared to some of the others. So overall, CO2 emissions from energy-related activities today count for about 66% of emissions of greenhouse gases. In the reference scenario, because of this rising global fossil fuel energy use, particularly in the developing world, it will continue to drive up energy-related CO2 emissions to 2030. In fact, if you look at the level here, we see that emissions will jump by 45% between 2006 and 2030 to over 40 gigatons. That's quite it's a 1.6% per annum increase. And non-OECD countries have become and remain the biggest contributor to global emissions. And the share increases over time. In fact, let's see. Coal in particular is the biggest contributor. It's not shown on the chart, but China and India and the U.S. Account for more than half of global emissions in 2030. China, by the way, already emits more than the United States. That's one area where they already have caught up with us because of their tremendous reliance on coal. We think that this trajectory puts the world on track for a long-term concentration of greenhouse gases. In the atmosphere, concentration of CO2 alone will be 750 parts per million. In terms of CO2 equivalent, if you throw in the other greenhouse gases, you're talking 1,000 parts per million under this scenario. And if you look at the International Panel on Climate Change's assessment, fourth assessment report, this could result in a global temperature increase of around 6 degrees Celsius. That's almost 11 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's going to be quite balmy in this part of the country if that happens. A change of this magnitude would disrupt natural ecosystems. It would dislocate agricultural activity. It would undermine human health and well-being. Quite honestly, in our view, this is a disaster. That's why I wanted to stress at the beginning that this is not our forecast. This is the scenario, and we developed the scenario because we hope we can change it. I mentioned the country breakdowns of emissions. In 2030, on current trends, China alone emits 11.7, almost 12 gigatons, whereas the US is less than 6. So right now, we're even with China. By 2030, China will be double ours. India will be 3.3. So together, that's 20.8 gigatons, which is a little more than half of total emissions. The Middle East will also be a major source of emissions. At 2.6 gigatons, it will be a more important emitter than Russia, with only 2 gigatons, or Japan with only 1.1. The European Union as a total only will have 3.8 gigatons. But fortunately, we don't think it has to be this way. The WEO has two alternate policy scenarios that we call 550 and 450. And that stands for 550 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, or 450 part per million CO2 equivalent. In developing these two policy scenarios, we focused on the role of the energy sector, concentrating on the period of 2030. To take account of the different circumstances and preferences of different countries, both scenarios assume the same growth as the reference scenario, and they're built on a hybrid policy approach that combines three different approaches: a cap-and-trade system for emissions, sectoral agreements, and what we call national policies and measures. And so if you look at this chart, it's a little bit busy, but what we've done is we've decided across the top, we have three columns. We've divided the world into three areas: OECD plus, which are basically developed countries; other major economies. This is where China and India are in here, Brazil, countries like that; and then other countries. This is where most of the countries of Africa and Latin America would be. We've divided world industry along the side here into four major categories: power generation, light industry, well, light and heavy industry both, I guess, transportation, and then down at the bottom, buildings. And we, like I said, we have three policy approaches. Cap and trade is shown in blue. National policies and measure is shown in the mustard colored. And international sectoral approaches are in white. And so what this chart is telling you is that for OECD countries and power generation, we think cap and trade will be applied. For other major economies, we think for power generation only national policies and measures will be applied. Other countries, we think they're only going to do national policies and measures. They're not going to join any cap and trade system. They're not going to be part of international sectoral approaches. But in point of fact, under our scenario, they contribute such a small part of emissions, we don't really have to hold them to the same standard. Now, cap and trade, I assume people are broadly familiar with. The idea being that you tell people they can only emit so much, and if they want to emit more, they have to buy the right to emit in an auction process. That's where the trading comes in. First they purchase. They're allowed the right to purchase certain certificates to emit, but if they want to exceed those emissions, then they have to buy other people's certificates. International sectoral approaches, we think these are important for industries that have a relatively few numbers of players, like the auto industry. It's few and getting fewer, perhaps. Steel is another one where you've seen a lot of consolidation. So we believe that some sectors lend themselves to an international agreement on that sector. For example, in autos, you could have an international agreement on fuel efficiency standards. You could do the same thing in the iron and steel industry or in the cement industry. So we think that those will be, there will be negotiations, perhaps starting next year at the Copenhagen meeting, that will lead to international sectoral agreements. And we believe the other major economies will also be part of those agreements. And that will be true in transport as well as in some heavy industry like iron and steel and cement. Now, buildings, the other thing that qualifies an industry is that it's traded, a tradable good. You know, airplanes and cars are traded, steel and cement are traded, but buildings are not traded. So we do not think there will be sectoral approaches to buildings. There may be similar standards applied, but basically we feel each country will probably adopt its own policies and measures on buildings, even in the OECD countries. So everybody, all countries, are going to have national policies and measures on buildings. But I don't want to denigrate the buildings, because buildings represent 40% of energy use worldwide. So there's a tremendous amount that can be done in buildings. So I just want to make, before I go on, I want to make one important point, that we're not prescribing or recommending that these actions take place. What we're simply doing is presenting a scenario projection that we believe would be required for us to actually meet with concrete policy changes, a greenhouse gas stabilization, in this case of 550 parts per million. In other words, why did we pick this? Because the International Panel on Climate Change has talked about 550 and 450 scenarios. They've modeled what they mean for global warming. According to the IPCC, the 550 policy scenario would lead to 3 degrees increase in temperature. Remember, the reference scenario was 6 degrees. So if we go to the 550, we've saved half of the global warming that we expect to see. If you go to 450, according to the IPCC, it's only a 2-degree increase. So that means we've cut the increase by 2/3 if we can make 450. And so what we've done, we've tried to choose what we think are realistic possible outcomes from the climate negotiations. We don't believe that you need to get a global cap and trade system to get to the 550. So you don't need to waste your time trying to make the perfect the enemy of the good. That you should focus on cap and trade in a fairly limited area, because that's where a lot of the emissions are coming from. Now, this is what it looks like in 550. In 450, you got to look carefully, because there's not a big change. All that happens when you go to 450 is the mustard in the other major economies for power generation and some industries becomes blue. So to get 450, we believe you have to get the other major economies to join the cap and trade system. There's no way around it. Let's see. Okay, and one of the things I want to stress, though, is that in this scenario, they only participate in the cap and trade from 2020 onwards. We're not expecting them to join right away. So, whereas in many OECD countries are already applying cap and trade. The European Union has their own ETS, emissions trading system. In the US, you have some initiatives. You have RGGI in the Northeast, you have the Western Governors Initiative, and so on. For that matter, President-elect Obama has also talked about cap and trade. So we think that the OECD countries will be moving, whether by agreement or individually, towards cap and trade systems much sooner than the other major economies. So I want to make that clear, that we're not expecting some kind of pie-in-the-sky breakthrough. Let's see. So we think we're leaving plenty of time to prepare for such a system. Another thing about the 450 policy scenario, it sees average fuel efficiency of the global light-duty vehicle fleet improving 43% beyond current standards. In the reference scenario, we only saw a 24% improvement in efficiency of automobiles. Light-duty vehicles is basically automobiles. The reference scenario called, like I said, 24%. In the 550 scenario, we see a 39% improvement in efficiency in autos. And the 450, we see a 43% improvement, which I believe is consistent with what Obama's been talking about. In fact, it may even be easier to achieve than some of his. Okay. This is, the red line is the, in this one, is the emissions under the reference scenario. It's the similar to the chart we had a few slides back. But now I'm going to add the emission scenarios for both the 550, which is the blue line, and the 450 scenario. What I want to stress is that we don't think we can go to 450 right away. We think it's only really after 2020 that the difference between the 450 and the 550 kicks in. But that means actually we're going to overshoot 450 initially. But if we adopt the policies we see, or that we saw in the previous slides, we believe that we can get back down to 450 by 2030 and beyond. In fact, you can see we're on a pretty good downwards trend in 2030, which will carry us to even lower levels in the future. Also, you notice, if you look to the left, that it's only the 450 that actually gets you to lower emissions than basically we have today. All the 550 does is get global emissions to level off, as I mentioned, they already have in the OECD countries. How do we achieve these reductions? The little bars on the right show you the contribution from 4 different areas. And I want to stress, energy efficiency is the most important area. In the 450 policy scenario, it's 54% of the reductions. In renewables account for another 23%. Carbon capture and storage is 14%, and nuclear is 9%. But basically, both scenarios that you're looking at, alternative scenarios, the 550 and the 450, require transformation of the energy sector. The 550 policy scenario is achieved mainly through the development of existing technologies or incremental improvements only. There is a change in the energy mix. Power sector sees more renewable energy, nuclear power, and carbon capture and storage to a small extent. In the transport sector, CO2 savings come from an enhancement of the internal combustion engine, from more rapid penetration of hybrids and lightweight materials, but also from somewhat from biofuels. The 450 policy scenario can only be achieved through stepped-up research development and subsequent demonstration and deployment of some new technologies to achieve the sharp reductions that we see after 2020. It assumes extensive deployment of carbon capture storage in OECD countries and in major non-OECD economies. This means retrofitting of existing power plants in the transport sector. In the transport sector, it requires the introduction of advanced second-generation biofuels, biodiesel, significant penetration of electric or fuel cell vehicles in global automobile markets, but only all of this after 2020. We basically think that existing technologies can put us on a pretty good trajectory to 2020, but then the new technologies that we believe can be developed realistically will, if we adopt them, if we develop them and then adopt them, will put us on the downward trend. In effect, realizing the efficiency gains of either of these policy scenarios, though, will be an enormous challenge. Hundreds of millions of households worldwide will have to purchase efficient technologies, such as clean vehicles, efficient appliances, or energy-efficient buildings. It's a daunting policy challenge for world governments. One of the things I want to, I'll go on instead. Let's see. This is a slide which shows the distribution of emissions in the 3 scenarios between the OECD and non-OECD for the current one, the world as a whole for 550 and 450. What's interesting here is that if you look at non-OECD economies, their emissions, according to the reference scenario, are above 25 gigatons, which, if you go to the right, is greater than the total world emissions under the 450 policy scenario. So what this tells us is we cannot achieve the OECD countries, the U.S. and its partners, and the IEA cannot achieve the 450 policy scenario alone. Even if we drove our emissions to zero, which some people sort of joke is happening, we will not be able to achieve the 450 scenario without the participation of the non-OECD countries. This is one of the reasons why the IEA is heavily engaged in outreach to China and India. One of my first trips as the new Deputy Executive Director of the IEA was to Beijing. Interestingly, I was invited by the Chinese to address a conference on energy efficiency. So the Chinese, I think, are responding to that price signal. They realize all of a sudden that energy efficiency is important, They're promoting it. And they're interested in their air quality in their cities. They're not so interested in global warming yet, but they are interested in reducing pollution in their cities. And therefore, I have some I think, grounds for optimism that China will continue to reform itself, and that we will avoid the reference scenario. But whether or not we get to the 450 policy scenario is another question. So in closing on this, I just want to say one thing's clear. In order to meet a 450 or a 550 part per million scenario, action needs to be global. There are many options for who ultimately pays for emissions reductions. Reductions to the reference scenario emissions are needed in all sectors, in all regions. And another point that I want to make is that if we just try and go it alone, we can't limit global warming to 2% or 2 degrees. And in some sense, energy independence is not possible in today's world. No country can be certain of a sustainable energy future unless we all cooperate. So, just to summarize, these are the key findings of the 550 policy scenario. 3 degrees global temperature rise. Energy demand continues to expand. The fuel mix is different. CO2 prices under a cap and trade system would probably reach around $90 a ton in 2030. Additional investment required is about 0.25% of GDP. That's about 6 trillion, I think it works out, something like that. Under the 450 policy scenario, you only get a 2-degree increase in temperatures. Energy demand continues to grow, but half as fast as the growth in the reference scenario. You get more rapid deployment of low-carbon technologies, particularly carbon capture and storage, which helps to avert the worst of global warming. You get a big fall in non-OECD emissions because they have to take part in a cap and trade. Because you're moving toward much more aggressively towards carbon capture and storage, the carbon price under emissions trading schemes will be higher, as much as $180 a ton. What's interesting is that we're still going to need more oil from Opec, even under the 450 policy scenario, up to 12 million barrels a day of increased production from Opec. And that's, remember, our scenario shows for slowly growing oil production even from OECD countries because of the non-conventionals. So that's the good news for this audience, I think, is the oil industry is not going to wither and die overnight. It's going to be with us for a long, long time, certainly well past my lifetime. And then finally, the additional investment needed is about 0.6% of GDP, which I think is $12 trillion or something like that, over 30 years, or I'm sorry, 22 years. But one of the things that's not in this list of bullets that I think we should add is that we also see savings in energy costs to consumers. Under the 550 policy scenario, we actually see total energy costs dropping by 7 trillion. That's more than the additional investment needed. So if you're sitting at, if you're thinking about public policy, which would you rather do? Invest in energy in your own country, in the development and deployment of new infrastructure, including renewables, better electricity grids, better roads can also contribute to energy efficiency, improvement in the technology of your auto industry, or send the money to OPEC. Simple as that. In the end, we believe that the 550 scenario, you cut global warming in half, you save money, and you create jobs in your own countries, and you improve your energy security. Because so much of the savings in emissions is due to energy efficiency. And the barrel you don't need is the most secure barrel of all. 450 is even better. It's a little more costly. The investment needs are a little bit greater than the savings you get from fuel. So you do have it does come at a higher price, but you reduce the potential for global warming even further. And you create even more jobs in your own countries because you're being more aggressive on things like carbon capture. Carbon capture, by the way, will require the construction of a huge infrastructure, but we believe it can be done. We've built an infrastructure that distributes natural gas all over this continent. Well, why not build an infrastructure that collects the CO2 and brings it back to points where it can be stored safely underground? So those are the results of the conclusion. And just to sum up, we believe the current energy trends, as laid out in the reference scenario, are unsustainable, socially, environmentally, economically. Oil will remain our leading source of energy, but the era of cheap energy, cheap oil, are over. Price volatility will continue. Oil field decline is the key determinant of investment needs. Oil market is undergoing major lasting structural change. National companies in the ascendancy, non-OECD countries being the location for the oil exploration and development. To avoid abrupt and irreversible climate change, we need a major decarbonization of the world's energy system. The Copenhagen conference must deliver a credible regime, or at least a credible process. We don't think changes will happen overnight. As I say, we think most of the changes will happen after 2020. If we want to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees, we need breakthroughs in technology and reductions in all regions. Mitigating climate change will substantially improve energy security. And we don't think that the present economic worries will justify backtracking or delay. In fact, I personally believe that investment in energy will be a very sound way to create jobs and help us get out of the economic crisis that we're in. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry it's gone on a little longer than I expected, but I hope it was interesting for you. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'm not going anywhere else today, so yeah. But if you have to go, please, I won't think you're rude if you leave, because I know we've gone over the time.
Thank you very much. It's an illuminating presentation. And I'm curious, the global financial downturn notwithstanding, because that's a vortex in and of itself, what do you see as the greatest obstacles to the investment that is necessary, and what are some tools through policy, private sector, whatever, that can successfully address those obstacles?
Well, in the short run, the biggest obstacle is probably the current financial crisis. But I think we'll get over that. I don't think it's going to last forever. Financial panics have a way of petering out. I remember the financial panic in Asia in the late 90s. Lasted, what, two and a half, 3 years. So I think the world economy will come back. But you've got to organize the investment. I think actually the plans that President-elect Obama is talking about make pretty good sense. I don't want to comment on specific policies, especially because we don't know exactly what they're going to come up with. But his goals are very consistent with the 450 policy scenario. I think it's going to take courageous political leadership. That's the basic answer. Yeah.
If one was not to accept that OPEC was going to be able to create 6 more Saudi Arabias, how would that impact the scenario?
Probably you'd have to violate the growth assumption. And that's not good news, because the developing world needs growth because their population is growing. I mean, one of the things that, if you really get into the forecast, we look at not just global numbers. In a presentation of this length, I mean, after all, the book's 600 pages, we get into greater detail. But basically, the global population is going to grow by about 1%, but in some parts of the world it's growing a lot higher. And you need real growth just to maintain per capita incomes. And so if you see falling per capita incomes, that's why I say this is not sustainable from a social standpoint.
So if that bridge of increased production isn't there, then you're talking about more social chaos.
What you'll do is you'll have price spikes, and then it'll choke off the economic recovery. That's what we're afraid, and that's our biggest fear right now. When we're reading, it's anecdotal at this point. You hear this and that project being delayed. Our concern is that, you get enough projects delayed that just as the economy starts picking up and demand starts growing, you're gonna run into a ceiling, and that'll choke off the growth.
To me, that's the toughest bullet.
Yeah, I'm from China. I have a question for you. Everybody, interested in China, talk about China a lot during your presentation. The picture is very clear. China needs world needs China. Somebody say China needs world as much as world needs China. But
we're stuck with each other.
Yes, did you have any concrete suggestions, especially at the IEA, how to cooperate with China? As I know, IEA signed an official agreement with China in 1996.
Yeah.
But cooperation is very few. Only some workshop.
Yeah. I think we're gradually accelerating our relationship with China. We're looking forward to next year the ministerial of IEA energy ministers. We'll meet in October, and we're cautiously optimistic that China will have a representative to that meeting. India as well, maybe Russia. We're also engaging China in meetings of the governing board. So I think we're engaging at a higher level, but also at a lower level. We're doing more of the kinds of things you talk about. The fact I was invited to this conference on energy efficiency, and the fact that China has recently announced changes in subsidy policies and maybe even having a tax on consumption and so on, I think shows that China is responding to the price signals, as Amy pointed out, and that's good news. And it's better for China. The great thing about energy efficiency is it pays for itself. There's a capital outlay that has to be made up front, but you immediately get it repaid. And if the world can figure out how to have a financial model that allows people to insulate their houses and their offices and change the lighting and so on, and repay the capital out of the stream of lower energy costs that result, we could really make very rapid strides in energy efficiency. But we have to do it. I mean, under our scenario, you take the current rate of improvement in energy efficiency of 1% a year and you make it 2.4% a year. Now, the highest it's ever been, I think, is 1.8 or 2. And that was back in the 70s, when we probably just about anything you did was more efficient than what you did before. So to not only increase the rate, but to double the rate when you've already had so many increases in efficiency is non-trivial. But your ace in the hole is very little has been done with buildings. You have a tremendous stock of old buildings that should be retrofitted. And you can do that if you come up, I think the person that develops a good financial model could make a lot of money. Those people that were doing REITs, real estate investment trusts, if they went into the business of doing renewable energy or energy efficiency investment trusts, I think they could make a lot of money and do the world a great service. And maybe they'll spend fewer days in purgatory for what they did with the subprime crisis. I don't know.
Yeah, question. You showed on one of your charts that you're working cap and trade and the assumptions as to who's going to be in the market. Is there a structural advantage in cap and trade versus carbon tax? Or it's just it could be one, the other, mixture of both?
Yeah, it could. Basically, our answer is that if a tax is efficient, it is like a cap and trade. The point is that sometimes you get inefficiencies with taxes, and that's why we put forward a cap and trade. The other reason is because there are actually people doing cap and trade now. Yeah, but you're right; they're very close.
On that issue, I noticed your carbon prices looked high relative to other analyses I've seen as what kind of level is required to produce lower carbon emissions. And is that the fact that you're basically limiting it to, a relatively small sector of the CO2 emission?
Yeah.
Okay. So and if you put a carbon tax on the entire buildings and people and everything else, the net cost could be less, or it could be.
Oh yeah, if you spread it wider, you're right. By concentrating it on a select number of industries, the price they have to pay is greater. But they're the ones that are emitting it, so maybe they should pay it. Yeah. I think that we don't really get into who bears the burden. That's a negotiation, and it can be worked out. Some scenarios actually have much higher prices. It depends just how far you want to reduce the emissions. Yeah.
Not a direct part of your purview, but at 450, is the world then in balance? Is the absorption rate of CO2 450? I mean, at 450, is it stop going up?
Yeah, it stabilizes at 450, but it still leads to a 2-degree, according to the IPCC. We don't have the capability of doing our own forecasts. But according to that, that's why we chose their scenario. So
at 550, you continue to be in trouble past 2030.
Yeah, and you get 3 degrees instead of 2 degrees. The question, and I don't think anybody knows the answer, is the warmer you get, the less predictable the situation is going to be, because you're going to get more and more melting of permafrost. And I don't know what will happen if the carbon that's sequestered in frozen permafrost is released into the atmosphere. There'll definitely be more carbon going into the atmosphere, but on the other hand, maybe there's also more area where plants can grow to sequester that carbon. So I don't know what the balance will be, but most people think that the balance of risks is in favor of runaway greenhouse gas emissions.
450 is kind of the target for stability.
Yeah. I mean, you can stabilize at different levels. 450 is a more desirable level to stabilize than 550. Yeah.
You spoke about a new role for oil companies with the NOCs, and talking about how the oil resources would be more and more in the hands of national oil companies. Could you comment at all about any new roles that you might see for the oil service companies? And in particular, would they be a vehicle to attract investment into NOCs as well as the IOC?
Yeah, I think so. In a way, what I was sort of alluding to was you might even see the IOCs evolving into super energy service companies. But if you have an energy service company, there's no reason it couldn't just get bigger. Yeah.
What do you see as the most debated topics in Copenhagen in the coming year?
I think who pays for it. I think India and China, from the little contact I've had so far in this job with their officials, would be happy to adopt whatever we want if we pay for it. But obviously we don't want to pay for everything. But in a global cap and trade system, that may be exactly what happens. Is that by people, by buying and selling emissions, in effect, transfer a lot of resources to developing countries because, although they're rising rapidly, their overall emissions are still low.
And is there a price tag on this? How much do we have to pay?
It's what the market evolves. That's the 90 versus the 180. Those are just our projections. Yeah.
One more question.
Okay. Well, I'll let you, if it's only one more, I'll let you choose.
Do you see any scenario where natural gas in this country could become a transportation fuel, and what effect that might have in your ultimate scenarios?
I'm pretty sure we probably did look at that. It may be factored in. I'm not sure for a fact. Natural gas, I think, has a very good future in the United States. We were actually, in recent years, we have developed natural gas in this country from non-conventional sources with the energy equivalent of 1 million barrels of oil a day. So that's a real success story, which probably a lot of you people know that, but not too many people seem to know that. If it were an oil field, if we discovered an oil field that was producing 1 million barrels a day, people would be really excited. But we found 1 million barrels a day equivalent of gas. But because it's a little bit here, a little bit there, nobody notices. but that's certainly transportation would be a very good, I mean, natural gas is a good fuel for transportation, so I'm sure that we've looked at that.
Well, I'd like to thank Ambassador Jones for an excellent presentation today. Want to let him relax for a little bit. It's a long time to be talking. We have some late lunch out in the common space for all of you who would be happy to join us, and I'm sure Ambassador Jones would be happy to discuss things with you over lunch. Let me again invite you all. December 15th is our next event, which is Transatlantic Climate Policy, very in line with Ambassador Jones' talk today. And we'll be talking about things like the harmonization of cap and trade programs, looking at what different regional and international challenges there are going to be. So I thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you.